Hello, hello. Thank you for coming back to my channel, or welcome. If this is the first time, my name is Jennifer and this is Jen the Bookworm. And I'm coming to you with something a little different today. Today I want to talk about my top 5 fantasy or urban fantasy series. I got the idea of doing this from another booktuber who was pretty new. And he decided to do a top 5 because he's just starting out and wasn't as very well read, but wanted to get kind of something on the channel that he could refer back to, something that he could update and see how far he's come or how much he's changed over the years of doing booktube. So that inspired me to do something similar. I would have said before doing booktube, before finding out about booktube, I would have said I was a fairly well-read person, but I'm not. There's so many books out there that I didn't even know existed. And as soon as I found booktube, my unofficial TBR or my wish list on audiobooks in days, I had like 30 new books that I needed to read. And as time has gone on, that number has just gotten more ridiculous. But I have to start someplace. Everybody does. And so this is the place that I'm starting from. I'm still relatively new on booktube. And so this is where I'm starting. These are my favorite fantasy and urban fantasy. I'm mixing the two genres because frankly, I don't have 5 fantasy series that are really that important to me, or 5 urban fantasy series that are really that important to me, so I had to mash them together. But I think it works because they're basically, urban fantasy, basically subgenre of fantasy, so I think it works. But I'm going to go in order of my favorite to least favorite. But some of the ones in the middle could be kind of moved around. Some of the ones in the middle, they're not really, it's not really fixed. But I'm excited to do this and then see what it looks like in the future. So the first series is kind of a controversial one. The first series that's my favorite fantasy series of all time up to this point is the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. And it's a controversial pick because Terry Goodkind has been accused of near plagiarizing or taking maybe too much influence from those that came before him. However, when I first started reading fantasy, I read a little bit of fantasy when I was in high school, but not very much. I picked up this series because my best friend at the time, he tells me, hey, my uncle wrote these books and would you like to read them? So I went to the bookstore and I bought the first 2 books in the series, pretty much sight unseen, pretty much just because I was trying to support my friend's uncle. And it took me a little while to get to the books, but when I did, when I sat down and started reading it, I was hooked right away. I really loved the world that was built. I really loved the characters. They were big books, but I didn't mind that at the time. They were immersive, and I enjoyed being in that world. And it was my first real introduction into an epic fantasy. So, although I'd heard of Lord of the Rings and I'd read The Hobbit, and this was prior to the movies coming out, I didn't know a lot about Lord of the Rings. I had heard of the Wheel of Time series, but I had not read it. Still have not read it. I actually don't plan to read it, but I didn't realize how much was potentially borrowed from, or how much it looked like it was heavily influenced from. All I knew was this series. I was introduced to these concepts by this series, and I loved it. And honestly, this series was there for me when I was in a bad relationship. It was a place I could escape to, and the series was here for me to help celebrate. It was the first books that I read on my porch or the brand new house that I bought, and so it was there through good times and bad times, and I've read not all of them, but quite a lot of them in the series. And now that I've started branching out and reading other fantasy, there are other fantasies out there that I am really enjoying, and I can see where there are going to be other fantasies that might overtake this one, but as of now, this is still my favorite series. I have, been more introduced to the ideas that, that other people have of this author. I've had a couple people tell me, oh, this author isn't as good as maybe George R. R. Martin or whatever, but this author was the author that I was introduced to when I was introduced to fantasy, really introduced to fantasy. This was the series that I read, and I still love this series. The second series that I really enjoyed and has been my favorite series for a long time, or one of my favorites, is the Hollow series, or sometimes called the Rachel Morgan series by Kim Harrison. This series was lent to me by a friend, and as soon as I started reading it, I had to go out and buy my own copies because it was so good. It had, vampires and werewolves and witches and leprechauns and just pixies and fairies and all of these fantasy and horror elements, and it was so interesting to me. I think this was the first urban fantasy that I ever read, and I'd never been introduced to the genre. Maybe this is a trend. The first that I read in a genre is going to be my favorite. But it was so good. And just to kind of give a small premise of the series, it's about witches and vampires and such have always existed on Earth. Have always existed in our world, but they've been in hiding because, humans tend to destroy things that they don't understand or things that are different than them, or if they're threatened by it. And so they have been in hiding. But a virus was let loose on the world, and it was very damaging. It killed off half the population of humans. It killed off, and it affected the other races a little differently, different for each race. Some of them, had a cold or flu-like symptoms, and some of them died, and there was a range of ways that it affected the other races. But the human race was half of them wiped out. And in order to save the population, the cultures within Earth and stuff, the other races came forward and said, yeah, we're here too. And felt, I guess, maybe a little bit more on even footing with the humans because they weren't so outnumbered. So the actual story takes place, I think, like 50 years from that point. So the virus has happened and is gone. The creatures, the fantasy creatures and races are an established part of the world, and there is still some having to deal with each other, but for the most part, everyone's worked out the initial uncomfortable, awkward prejudices and such. There are still some prejudices that exist, but for the most part, it's much more. It's been advanced. It's not the beginning of the problem. So I thought that this was a really interesting premise. I had never seen anything like that before. So I really enjoyed the books. There are quite a few books in the series. I read all of them, read the last book that she wrote in the series, and that was it until she decided to write some more. So there are, like, I think 2 books at the end of the series that I have not yet read, but I've read most of them, and they continue to be one of my favorite series. The third series that is my favorite is Harry Potter, and this was written by J.K. Rowling. Harry Potter series. Obviously, there's different titles for every book. And I probably don't need to tell anybody what the Harry Potter series is. If you know anything about books, you probably know this book series. When I started reading it, I was in my early 20s. And I think it was the first kids book that I decided to pick up in my adult years, if you can call early 20s adults. But I watched the movie. I think somebody really wanted to watch the movie, and I went with them. And I thought, wow, this is a really cool premise. So I decided to pick up the book. I picked up the first 2 books. I believe there were only 2 books out at the time. I'm not sure if the 3rd book was out or if it was just out in hardback. I don't know. Anyway, I picked up the first 2 books and I breezed through them. I think it only took me a day to read each book. But I loved it. Especially loved the parts that don't make it to the movie, actually. My favorite parts are the parts like in the beginning that show him at the Dursleys or at the Weasleys, and somewhat at the end. They don't always show. I mean, the movies have to cut out some of it so that they can make room for all the action in the middle. So I get that, but those are some of my favorite parts of the book. The parts that are not well expanded on in the movies. And I think the 7th book was the first book that I went to the store and I bought it, and I came home and I opened it and started reading it that day. I don't think I've ever done that with a book before. It's just usually I buy a book and it marinates on my bookshelf for a few days or for a few months or longer before I actually pick it up and read it. And this was prior to me doing mostly audiobooks, but even audiobooks, I will buy an audiobook and it'll be sitting there for a while waiting for me to get to it. That's just how it goes. But I loved the Harry Potter series so much that I just could not wait to find out what happened. And I devoured that book. It took me more than a day, but I devoured it. It was great. And it continues to be one of my favorite series even today. The 4th series that I have on my list is another urban fantasy, and it is the Mercy Thompson series, or sometimes called the Mercedes Thompson series, and that's by Patricia Briggs. I love the writing style is very accessible. I love Mercy because she's kind of a badass, but she's not I don't know, she's not like purposely trying to make waves or anything, but she is who she is, and she likes what she likes, and if you don't, then that's fine. I like that she's a mechanic, and she that's not usually a job that you see your female protagonists be. You don't see them being, so I liked that about her. I liked that she was kind of a tough girl, but also a tough girl who she liked to bake cookies, and I don't know, she just was a mix in a way that was believable, in a way that didn't say, I'm badass chick, but I'm feminine chick. It was just a nice blending of the two in a more realistic kind of, I know people who fall into both categories. I don't know very many people who are only one or only the other. So I like that about the main character. And this series is about, she's a shapeshifter. She shifts into a coyote, and she lives near a pack of werewolves. And it's mostly a werewolf type story. But there are other things. There are vampires and other things in this world as well. and mythological creatures from not just Western mythology. And I thought it was a very fun story. There are some really cool characters in it that I just love, and so I had a lot of fun reading this series. And there's a couple of books towards the end. I think she just came out with a new book in the series, just like last couple of days. But there are a couple of books I haven't yet read, and so I kind of feel like I need to re-pick up this series and maybe read it, maybe vlog it, maybe get reacquainted with Mercy Thompson, because it's been a little while since I've read it. The last series will be no surprise to anybody who's been watching my channel, but it is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. As of filming this, I have read 3 books. I have not read the short stories yet. I have not read the 4th book, and I think the 5th book is I think it's out. It's about to come out. Something. I haven't read those yet. But I have read enough to be able to say this is going to be, when I finish it, one of the best fantasies that I've ever read. And I would not be surprised if sometime down the road it becomes number 1. It's so involved and so accessible. I love it. I love how, they're chunky books, but I love being in this world, so I don't mind at all. And I love the characters. I love the writing. And I'm not the first person to say, but he is very good at, his writing is very accessible. It's not terribly flowery and it's not over the top. It's easy to get through. His books are long, but I never feel like, oh, when is this going to be over? I never feel that way. I never feel like it's a slog to get through it. I never feel like I'm daydreaming about moving on or whatever. When I got to the end of the 3rd book, I was glad to be done, but wished I wasn't yet. I was talking to some people on Discord, and they had just started it, or they were partway through it, and I felt envy for them to be experiencing it for the first time, and I had already experienced it, and I wasn't yet quite finished with it when I was feeling that way. So it's a great series. He's a great writer. I love how all the books, they don't necessarily leave off with cliffhangers, although they do leave off with things for the next book to pick up. But any big cliffhangers that are announced early on in the book are solved within the book, and I do love that about him. And I think it's got one of the cooler magic systems that I've ever come across. So unique. I've never seen this before. And like I said, I started out this video by saying I hadn't been exposed to a lot. And so maybe there are a lot of other magic systems that are cooler or that are similar, but I've never seen something like this in what I've read. And I really, really think it's interesting, and it's inspiring. It's inspiring. I want to read more. It's inspiring as a writer. I love Brandon Sanderson. And I'm a new convert to Brandon Sanderson. I'm about to start on some other books of his that are not in the Stormlight Archive, and I'm excited to see how they measure up. They're older books that he's written, so maybe before his talent got completely evolved to where it is now, or maybe it's every bit as good as the Stormlight Archive. We shall see. So that was my list of my top 5 series that both in fantasy and urban fantasy, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to me talk about what I loved reading, and I hope that it was fun for you. It was fun for me, and I'm really looking forward to maybe next year or the year after, when I decide to update this list, when I make it a top 10 instead of a top 5 or whatever, and I start updating the list with the things that I've been reading now, because there are quite a few other stories that could be contenders on this list. the Dresden Files by Jem Butcher, and maybe other Brandon Sanderson books once I've read them. And there are lots of things that I'm reading now that that I maybe wouldn't have read before if I wasn't being kind of encouraged by having a booktube and by being part of the booktube community. So I'm really looking forward to how this list might change one day. So that's what I have for you, and I appreciate you spending your time with me, and I hope that you will like and subscribe if you haven't already. It's free to do, and it helps out my channel a lot. And if you have any comments, tell me what your favorite, you can do top 5, you can do just fantasy, you can do urban fantasy. What's your tops? The books that you really love. Have you read any of the series that I mentioned, and what do you think about them? I would love to know. Maybe if you list something that's a top 5 for you, it will encourage me to start it, and I'll see. Maybe it'll make it on one of my lists. It'll be a top 5 for me in the future. Never know. So thank you very much for spending this time with me. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.